Hey guys, so today you and I are going to talk about outsourcing. So let's get into it. So the question in question was, Frederick, there is a programmer shortage. What do you think about offshoring to East Europe or India and outsourcing in general? I have heard some bad stories. Well, those stories are probably true, because usually the stories about outsourcing is, horror stories. They claim to see all kinds of levels of incompetency. Sometimes it's even malicious practices within different companies and so forth. The thing that I think, though, is that that has less to do with outsourcing in of itself, and it has more to do with the company who's doing the hiring. You see, this idea that, alright, if you're gonna start hiring people from offshore, like if you're gonna offshore some of your development process to East Europe or India, it doesn't really matter which country it is, you're still doing the exact same thing as you would do if you hired people from a consultancy in your local town. Now, the problem with outsourcing is usually not that you can't find good developers in Eastern Europe or India or some other place. Of course you can. It's not about that just because you're outsourcing that you're stuck with subpar developers. It's more complicated than that. The reason why you hear these sorts of horror stories is usually because the people who are outsourcing those companies, they're usually outsourcing to save cost or to save on cost. Now, the problem with that is not necessarily that it's a bad thing to save on cost per se. It's just that it's a very tricky thing to do in software development, because the people who usually know what they're doing, they're fucking expensive. That's a problem. And so if you're gonna, it's sort of like if you're gonna hire an artist or a musician or something like that, you can hire somebody who's really, really good, but it's probably gonna cost you something, quite a lot probably. And you can of course just pick somebody who is really, really cheap, but the odds are that the music or the art or whatever they're doing is probably not going to be all that good, because if it was really, really good, it's more likely that they would cost more. That's not necessarily true, but I hope that you see my point. So that's actually the really hard part about being a company who's trying to save on development cost. And if I'm completely honest, I think that outsourcing in general is if it's done right, it's no different from, as I said, hiring consultants. And there's nothing wrong with hiring consultants. It's no different from hiring in-house developers. It's the same deal. You're just hiring a person. The problem is that there's this weird prejudice in some people's heads that go, oh, if you're a full-time hire, you are that type of person. Or if you're a consultant, you're just in it for the money, or like these sorts of things. And guys, what's the red thread between that and racism or sexism or whatever ism you pick? You're basically just generalizing a person who is an individual, who is a completely unique individual, who is, if we are completely honest, probably not as logically thinking as you think. Sure, there are people who are consultants just for the money, but then there are people who are consultants because they like the freedom, or because they just had a good experience. They came into the industry that way and they just kind of stuck with it. I mean, shit, I have the same sort of deal, right? I don't really have a very strong argument why I would be a full-time hire, like work for a product company full-time instead of just, becoming a consultant for that same company, because they would hire me as a consultant as well and make more money. It's just that, I don't know, I'm not doing it. I could, but I'm not really interested in maximizing my profits. So what I'm saying is that this idea that people have, that outsourcing is just bad, and all these horror stories, I argue that that has less to do with the act of outsourcing your work and more to do with the company who's doing it. Because I work these days, I work for a a pretty big company, and we hire a lot of consultants. A lot of the best developers we have are consultants, and they've been working for longer than me at that company, and most of them are really, really good, and there's no issue with quality in the things that they produce or anything like that. All the stereotypical things that you hear about are usually not true. They're actually really, really good. And the reason why that's not a classical horror story as the ones that you've been hearing about, most likely, is because the company that I work with knows how to hire a good person. Well, not all the departments, but the departments that actually do that, that hire the people that I work with. Because they have the key element that every single software company who's hiring anybody needs. And that is, number one, a working IT department full of experienced people who are trustworthy. And the second thing is a good hiring manager who understands how to hire good software developers. The companies who don't have this are the people who you usually hear about when you hear about horror stories. And trust me, guys, I've heard horror stories from outsourcing companies from different parts of the world to specific consultancies, even here in Sweden. So I really do want you to understand that, guys. Sure, different regions and different markets have different ways of doing things in IT, but the base problem is always the same. If you try to simplify or like lower the quality of your hiring process as an IT company, then you have made your own bed. That's what I think. That's the thing that I feel about outsourcing. Outsourcing is an amazing way to scale up a company really, really fast because, I mean, the scale up that we did, or that I'm not sure if it's still going to go on when this airs, but we literally need hundreds of people. There's no way we're going to find 100 super amazing full-time hires who are all willing to commit to the company in the shortest the amount of time that we have on our hands. So consultancies are a very efficient way to get that when you have the funds to actually get these sorts of people. And in some cases, guys, the only way to get some of the top talents in the industry is through consultancies. That's the only way, because they're not interested in working for or committing to a company, and that's fine, because as I've said in other videos, it's like hiring mercenaries. You can hire really great mercenaries, but if everybody in the entire army is a mercenary and you're not able to trust the people with that there's some type of structure to making sure that you're actually just getting trustworthy mercenaries, they're gonna bankrupt you. And it's the same thing with the outsourcing. So what I want you to take away from this is that for me, outsourcing doesn't matter if it's to East Europe, India, Switzerland, France. I don't care. It's the same deal regardless of where you go. Each and every single consultancy, because that's usually what outsourcing is about, is a company that does the exact same thing. They are hiring headcount. That's all they're interested in. They do not care if your product succeeds or fails, as long as you are making them money, because they are not there to see your company succeed. They're there to make sure that you have the people that they are selling. That's what they're after. That means that just as any product, like as if you're a consumer, it's the same thing with the shampoo industry, it's the same thing with everything. Like if everybody's going to try to sell you their shit, and if you as a consumer if you do not possess the skills to make an informed decision when you're purchasing something, you should not make a purchase. And that's, in my opinion, the problem with outsourcing. It's not that there's some weird thing about that, oh, people in the West are so much better at coding than the people who come from from East Europe or wherever. That's not the case. Some of the best people in the world they're basically across the entire map for the most part. And the way you find them is the same way everybody does it. Or rather, this way that everybody should be doing it, and that is to have a good interviewing process and a very good IT department who knows how to hire good people. If you have those two things in place, outsourcing is an amazing way for you to very quickly scale up practically any company. And but you remember, it's always a way off. It's really down to how you want to run your business. Outsourcing is usually more expensive than getting full-time hires, but it's also very slow to get full-time hires, depending, of course, how you outsource. Because just because you're outsourcing things doesn't necessarily mean that you're always going to get the cheapest, the cheapest cost, right? Because if you, as I said, if you're only interested in the cost factor, then it's very likely, at least based on my experiences, that you're going to get very bad developers. And a lot of these horror stories come from the fact that it comes from the fact that the company was trying to save as much money as possible, regardless of like what that would do to the code base. And as I said, that's not a problem with outsourcing, that's a problem with that company. Because, as I'd like to say, there's a certain level, I think there's a minimum level of quality that is necessary to sustain a system. You don't have to have like a super system like Google's systems or anything like that, but you have to have like a base layer. Otherwise, the whole thing collapses. Have a great day.